The 14th of May, 1939, in Beverly Hills, MGM Studios called for all the journalists in Hollywood. Two of their biggest stars just got married, Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor.
Mayer basically just said, "You're going to have to marry her," and he said, "Yes, sir." That's the most romantic story, isn't it?
It was all arranged. As long as he said, "I do," he did his part.
Despite the studio's interference, Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor sincerely loved each other. However, their personalities were radically different.
If Robert Taylor hadn't existed already, then Hollywood would have probably had to create him.
He was just so beautiful, not only physically, but emotionally. He caused no problems. He was just a consummate professional.
She's a great prodigy because she's simple and she's streamlined.
She was a dedicated actress who could show vulnerability and grit and honesty and all in one scene.
She was not just a film noir icon, but an icon of Hollywood. She was a self-made woman. She's self-made. She's a self-made star.
But Barbara Stanwyck was born far, far away from the glamour of Hollywood.
She was born Ruby Catherine Stevens in 1907 in Brooklyn, New York. Of 5 children, she was the youngest one.
When she was 3 years old, she was on a streetcar with her brother, and the story is that a drunk on the streetcar kicked her mother in the stomach, and her mother was pregnant with another child at that time. The mother fell off the streetcar, she lost the baby, hemorrhaged, and she died.
The father eventually abandoned the family by going to Panama to go digging in a canal or something, and never came back. Can you imagine this?
Young Ruby finds herself orphaned and began a habit of moving to and from foster homes. Never having had a family is something she suffered through her whole life.
She had to take care of herself and be self-sufficient, but she always escaped into the movies. She loved going to the movies, and she loved especially Pearl White and the serials, The Perils of Pauline.
You can understand why this young child, this young Ruby, just loved Pearl White. My gosh, Pearl White had a gun, you know, she held up these men, banged them on the head, fought them, beat them up. I mean, she must have loved it. And that's what she wanted to do.
Robert Taylor's childhood, on the other hand, is much less dramatic. He grows up far from the suburbs in the Midwestern countryside.
He was born in 1911 in Nebraska. His name was Spangler Arlington Brew. Quite a name. His mother was sickly, and his father became a doctor to save her life, essentially. His mother was unusual, and she wanted to raise him basically as something like her little doll, for lack of a better term. And she didn't let him do a lot of things.
At 19 years old, young Spangler tried to get away from the family nest. He left to study music in California.
He was obviously a very good-looking man, but he was not manly at all. He was actually a terrific mama's boy.
He was called the Sheik because he dressed so well, and he just looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine all the time. He joined the theater group at school, and he did very well. He just found that he really enjoyed it, and so he was warring between the theater and his musical career.
It's within a different theater background that Ruby became known. At 14 years old, during Prohibition, she tries her luck on Broadway as a cabaret dancer.
Many of them were cigarette girls, or they worked in the bar area. They were showgirls. They would show themselves off. If they could sing, they would sing. In other words, you would have many different jobs.
The girls are together, they're not getting enough to eat, but there's, excitement, things are going on. It's better than working in the department store. She wasn't tied down. she was free.
At 15 years old, she got pregnant and apparently had a botched abortion, which later was to haunt her. Years later, when she wanted to have children, she couldn't.
It wasn't actually very often that a chorus girl would go into legitimate theater.
By 1926, she meets Willard Mack. He was a producer who was doing this play called The Noose. And he hired her along with others. They were like dancers, extras in the background. And he rewrote the play, giving her an actual speaking role.
She said for the rest of her life that he trained her and he made sure that she knew how to make an entrance, she knew how to get the attention. And so The Noose really got her a lot of attention.
Renamed Barbara Stanwyck by the producer of the play, it was under this new name that she was introduced to the theater stars of the time.
The king of vaudeville in the 1920s was a man named Frank Fay. And they didn't like each other very much at that time, but in the 1920s, in her milieu, there was no one more famous.
So Fay kind of mentored her, and that's how she married Frank Fay.
The two married in 1928. She was 21 years old, and he was 10 years her senior.
We have to understand, her mother died, her father left her, her sisters weren't around, she was on her own. She felt that he could take care of her, and he was going out to Hollywood. They wanted him out in Hollywood.
Was told in New York that Hollywood is hiring anybody that had a decent speaking voice, or could dance, or be in music, musicals, something that people could hear.
You are not only going to have the opportunity of seeing Mr. Jolson, but through this marvelous invention, Vitaphone, you are also going to be able to hear him talk as well as sing.
Sound came to movies. So a lot of the actors and actresses who became the legends of classic Hollywood came from Broadway, and she was one of them.
Most of the companies that are hiring were the new companies that were called Poverty Row Studios. The first one that she went to was a company called Columbia Pictures, which was formed in 1926. And by 1927-28, they had already invested money, everything they had in sound equipment.
Columbia at the time was known for making cheap B-movies that could be distributed through the majors, or what we might call two-reelers now, things that could be made cheaply and efficiently and every week. They made a movie a week.
Columbia's main director was a young Italian-American by the name of Frank Capra. He offered Barbara her first major role in Ladies of Leisure in 1930. In all, they made 5 films together.
They worked really well together, and so there was some sort of synergy. She was, I think, a cinematic muse for him.
Capra saw that she was best on her first take, and that if you asked her to do it again right after, she would get worse and worse and worse. That's why she fit in at Columbia, because they weren't doing a lot of takes of things.
So here we have this fighter, Ruby, changed to Barbara Stanwyck, and here she comes to the studio, which is the fighting studio, the Poverty Row studio. It was a perfect fit.
Barbara made a place for herself in Hollywood, but she was still far from working for the more prestigious studios.
MGM was the Tiffany of the studio system, where they were known for glamour, high gloss, amazing Art Deco sets, Greta Garbo, Norma Shearer, the best stars.
To find them, MGM deployed talent scouts, or headhunters. In 1933, they came across a young actor with the perfect profile and arranged for him to meet with the heads of the studios.
The first time Mayer saw him on screen, he said, you know, he needs a new hairdo, he's gonna have to add a few pounds, we have to sculpt him a little bit. You know, basically he remade him at that point. But he knew that he had the material to work with.
I don't think that the first name Spangler would play very well in 30s and 40s Hollywood.
Robert Taylor was pretty innocuous, but it was manly. They had a plan for Robert Taylor. From the get-go, they planned to make him a matinee idol. He wasn't up to snuff as far as they were concerned, So they made him work out to a point where his biceps were enlarged X number of inches, his chest went wider, his weight went up about 20 pounds, and you could tell the difference when you looked at him.
They had to design his entire persona down to the way he talked and the way he acted and the way he walked.
The best-looking and most gifted of the new leading men.
Robert Taylor saw a father figure in Louis B. Mayer, and as such, he was respectful. He was a very respectful man, period. He had been taught to believe in his elders, and Mayer took him under his wing like he treated him like a son.
Robert Taylor trusted Louis B. Mayer. After the death of his father in 1934, he moved to Hollywood with his mother. A year later, he gained his first success.
Magnificent Obsession was kind of the ultimate early Robert Taylor part because he was playing a sacrificing, understanding doctor.
He did play a lot of doctors in those early days. He had the look that he could have been a doctor.
Wouldn't you love to have a doctor like Robert Taylor?
Yeah, what's so funny?
I'm sorry, but it just occurred to me that in this case the operation was successful, but the doctor died.
The studios were able to manipulate people's emotions. They would place someone's face in a fan magazine and say there's 100,000 screaming girls who were waiting to meet him when he pulled into the train station in Topeka, Kansas. And because they said that, people would believe it. And so at the next train station down the road from Topeka, Kansas, 100,000 screaming girls really would be waiting in the station there.
I think it was his first trip overseas, and it was on a ship, and he gets to his room, he thinks he can relax, and two girls pop up from under his bed. And, you know, he's like all in a tizzy because of this. He carts them out, takes them down to the thing and makes sure they get off the boat. And later on he finds out that they were plants from the studio so that they could get a big press piece in the newspapers on this.
Robert Taylor was a pure product of the Hollywood studios. Barbara Stanwyck wasn't so lucky. She had to create her own luck, with her difficult past as her only asset.
Well, they took away all my privileges. But there's one privilege they can't take away from me, you dirty little sneak.
She was always playing working-class heroines who were standing up to rich snobs and fighting their way. And you know, she'd scrub the floors and she'd go to jail.
She could be simultaneously tough and vulnerable and could switch that in a minute in a film. And I think in the Depression era, grit and determination, despite what circumstances are handed to you, must have resonated with an audience that was dealing with really adverse economic circumstances.
It's about as unethical.
Oh, ethics, ethics, ethics. That's all I've heard since I've been in this business. Isn't there any humanity in it? Aren't there any ethics about letting poor little babies be murdered?
Is this era in Hollywood cinema really until probably the 70s and the Hollywood Renaissance era, where you see a more liberal representation of women's sexuality, things from alcohol and drug use, or just a look at how the system was failing everyday Americans. Some of the most compelling roles for actresses in Hollywood were in this era, and this is when Stanwyck made her reputation.
The cinema was never as free as in the early 1930s. Stanwyck played her most nefarious role in Babyface in 1933.
Darryl Zanuck, who was the VP of production at Warner Brothers, wanted to do a female version of the gangster films.
In Babyface, Barbara Stanwyck plays a woman who has been abused, as she was when she was a teenager.
Yeah, I'm a tramp, and who's to blame? My father. A swell start you gave me. Ever since I was 14, what's it been? Nothing but men, dirty, rotten men. And you're lower than any of them. I'll hate you as long as I live.
The second act of the film is this motif of a New York skyscraper, and every time she sleeps with a new man, we pan up to the next floor. But you like her. You don't think she's a bad person. You admire her just like you would James Cagney, the Public Enemy, who's shooting anyone who's in his way so he can get to the top of the underworld.
Lily, you got to marry me. If you don't, I'll kill myself.
It's an outrageous movie. It really is. And there were scenes that were found that were censored that makes it even more outrageous. And Stanwyck herself had input on the script. When they were having script sessions, they let her in, and she made suggestions for this movie.
Stanwyck didn't hesitate to stand up to the producers of the studios. She even dared to question the exclusivity of her contract with Columbia.
She argued that I can work at Warner Brothers and I'm not coming back until you cave in to give me more money. And then they all worked it out. She got the raise at Columbia, not as much money as she wanted, but pretty good amount. And then she also got to concurrently work at Warner Brothers. Then by 1935, she's going full freelance.
She worked all over the place. I can't think of a studio she didn't make a major movie for or a string of major movies for. And it was really brave of her to do that.
Frank Fay, her husband, is the one who advised her to do that. She would sign for 1 or 2 pictures at Columbia, 1 or 2 pictures at Warner Brothers, and that's why she really had her pick of the best subjects. And that's also why, probably, she never won an Academy Award, because there was no incentive for any studio to vote for her.
Her and her husband, Frank Fay, this Hollywood thing was just a way to make money, but they were going to go back to the stage and go back to New York, or if it didn't work out, they would move back to New York, so they didn't want to be tied down.
Frank Fay, his film career is not working out. He was a drinker and very egotistical.
He would be verbally and very physically abusive. She might even show up on set with bruises. But they adopted a kid, Dion Anthony Fay, I think in '33, to try to save their marriage, and that did not help things.
And he threw their son Dion into a pool, and he was just a little kid at that time. So finally, she divorced Frank Fay, and that was the end of it.
At 28, Barbara was a single mother.
She thought that she would be a good mother and she wanted to adopt a child. I think she realized not soon afterwards that that wasn't the case, and she was in fact a terrible mother, and a terrible mother to this poor child.
The thing about Dion is he wasn't a good student. He got into trouble. He was a little overweight. He wasn't what she wanted. It didn't reflect well on her. And it reminded her of Frank Fay. So all these things. She sent him away to military school. She was friends with Zeppo Marx, who was the fourth Marx brother who sang in their movies. She was great friends with him. He had become an agent at that point.
They went into business together in raising horses. So they purchased this big property out in the San Fernando Valley called Northridge, and Zeppo built his house on one side. She built her big house on the other side. They were neighbors, and they called the whole thing Marwick. Get it? From Marx Brothers and Stanwyck, Marwick.
Zeppo's wife was her very good friend, and she was trying to get her to go out. And so Zeppo made some sort of arrangement and said that they were going to have her go out and meet RT. And that was what he said, RT. They were introduced to each other. And he said, you know, will you dance with me? And she says, well, sure, I'm here to meet someone, but, you know, why not? And the Marx started laughing because they knew RT was Robert Taylor, there he was in the flesh, and she didn't get it. So that was their very first meeting, and yes, it was arranged.
She was attracted to him because he was younger than her. Not a lot, but she wasn't a cougar, but a couple years. And Fay was so much older than her, and I think tried to dominate her and exploit her, her youth.
What a relief to date someone who was younger, very good looking, and someone who she could help, she could teach him.
Robert needed Barbara's advice. When they met in 1935, he was 24 years old, 4 years younger than she was.
He was acting with Greta Garbo, so that was a big deal to be in Camille, and he was sort of known as a pretty boy.
I could kill you for this.
I'm not worth killing, Armand. I've loved you as much as I could.
Barbara Stanwyck worked with him on every bit of that performance. When he would come home at night, she would work with him.
Professionally, he found confidence from her in that he could actually act.
He was in awe of her. You know, he was still a rather young man, not sure of the industry. And so here he was with Barbara Stanwyck. She'd been around the block more than a couple times.
They were more, you know, just kind of hanging out as friends. And they would go to this newsreel theater on Sunset Boulevard and watch I don't know if they were really watching the newsreels, but it was a way for them to be private and be together. So I think it started out as a friendship, but then evolved into companionship.
Robert Taylor was attracted not only to Barbara, but also her lifestyle. He too settled down in the valley of San Fernando, in a ranch neighboring the Marwick.
During the 1920s and 30s, many of the actors and actresses loved horses. Many of them who came from New York City wanted to ride, they wanted to be free. That was their sport. Many of them, the men particularly, became polo players, and some of them really were good at it. It was like a horse society within the Hollywood colony in itself.
They were getting closer, and they were effectively a couple already. Their ranches were next to each other. They were living essentially as man and wife, probably in all fashions.
By that point, the two had been spotted together. They were likely an item on the Hollywood scene.
Louis B. Mayer and MGM weren't very happy. They didn't think it was the best alliance for him. And I think they also knew that she wasn't a malleable person. She did what she wanted pretty much. And so, but then once they knew that they were together and it was going on for a while, they decided to capitalize on it.
Just like the actors were controlled by the studios, I think there's this idea that the fan magazines were puppets of the studios. And it's true, there was a symbiotic relationship. Howard Strickling at MGM, who was the publicity director, would feed things to the fan magazines and vice versa.
Movie magazines started all the way back to the beginning of the film industry to promote the films. But by the time the 20s and 30s came along, they were promoting the stars. Because why? Because people would come to see their favorite star. That's make more money for the film.
Chris, aren't you going to kiss me?
You're my brother's wife, Rita. I wouldn't even hold your hand while that condition exists.
But you want to, don't you?
No, I came up here to see what kind of a hat you were wearing.
Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor were united at MGM in their first feature together, His Brother's Wife, in 1936.
Oh, darling.
We never expected an ending like this, did we, dear?
There will be any kind of ending now.
I never dreamed.
Neither did I. When did you first...
Oh, way back in the milk wagon age, I guess.
Darling.
The film allowed Barbara to regain success after the studio set up the Hays Code in 1934.
And that was censorship. And so all of these amoral women who were sleeping their way up to the top of banks, that went in 1934. And there's a big change in her film. It takes her a little while to get her footing in the post-code world.
From Stanwyck's perspective, to be working at MGM was a big deal. That was considered the best studio in town at the time. So that wouldn't have been a step down for her, even if the role necessarily wasn't as interesting as the earlier roles you were just talking about, like Babyface. But it would up her value in the Hollywood community that she had a deal at MGM.
She was being seen with an up-and-coming, handsome young man, and he was being seen with this very talented settled actress. It was a win-win for both of them.
I think he was probably less of a pretty boy after that. You know, he got to do swashbuckling parts and costume pictures and romantic dramas.
A Yank in Oxford really created an uproar because he was seen without a shirt on. He had a very hairy chest, and that literally created a fashion that lasted for a time because women wanted men with hairy chests after they saw that. And so what was basically a hairpiece for chests started being made in honor of Robert Taylor in that scene.
Stanwyck and Taylor made a second film called This Is My Affair in 1937. But the result was not up to the studio's expectations, and they didn't star together again for a long time.
There was never really a lot of fire between them on screen. So they're kind of one of those rare screen couples where their chemistry comes from their reputation and from real life rather than from actually watching what's on screen. Because you watch them together as a couple and they're, you know, you're kind of like, well, they get along fine, but it's not where you say, wow, I can imagine them having sex together.
Stanwyck and Taylor were so public that it seemed they forgot they weren't married. In 1939, a photoplay article accused them of immorality.
What happened is the article named Taylor and Stanwyck, Gable and Lombard, Charlie Chaplin and Paulette Goddard, Constance Bennett and Gilbert Roland. And so all those people I just mentioned were freelancers or independent artists at that time.
What they were being accused of, sleeping with each other without benefit of a marriage license. That's basically what they were being accused of.
And it's also challenging the idea of the production code, which always promotes marriage as the solution. Most Hollywood films at the time were ending in that kind of marital relationship, so the article is questioning the whole way the system works, from the institution of marriage to Hollywood censorship to the studios.
They were always afraid of censorship, and more censorship, and people rejecting their films because of shady morals.
So Louis B. Mayer put a stop to that. He basically said, you're getting married. And what he said goes. You know, it happened.
On May 14th, 1939, at midnight, Robert Taylor and Barbara Stanwyck were declared husband and wife. They had no honeymoon trip nor night.
The night they married, he went back and stayed with his mother.
He hadn't told his mother that he was getting married, and he told Barbara that he had to go tell his mother before she found out, and he did not spend that night with Barbara. He spent the night not with his mother, but at his mother's house. There were many rumors that there was a quote-unquote lavender marriage.
A lavender marriage is it's a marriage where one or both of the couples are together because they're homosexual or bisexual. It's just a way to get people to stop talking about them. And, you know, I'm sure there has been more than a fair share of marriages in Hollywood that have been very lavender, or even outright pink. But I don't really know if that's one of them.
She had been reputed to be a lesbian going back to her early days doing stage work in New York, where she hung out with a group of very well-known and open lesbians in the theater, and that just continued in Hollywood.
That was part of her image, even as a young woman, that she wasn't a girly girl, she wasn't glamorous, she didn't care about dresses, and she didn't care about being sympathetic.
But that also might be why there's some rumors about her sexuality, which is, I think, a little cliche, that a woman who wouldn't be all glammed up and made up with makeup off screen might be a lesbian, but she just wasn't so concerned about it.
When it comes to actual evidence, there doesn't seem to be any. Aside from the fact that she was very close to a woman named Helen Ferguson. She did publicity for Stanwyck.
Taylor, he was a beautiful man. So I think questions about his sexuality came up pretty immediately. Also, he was cast against very talented actresses like Stanwyck, like Garbo, like Irene Dunne, who were older than him. So he also had this kind of like boy toy reputation.
He was raised by an overbearing mother. He was raised to look effeminate. Intentionally, that's what she did to him. And he was such a gentleman. He was such an easygoing individual. And I just think that his persona allowed for that to propagate.
I do think her and Taylor did have a love. Was it always romantic? Was it always sexual? I don't know. But I don't think their relationship was a sham.
Their holiday reels testify to the complicity of the two spouses. Yet they managed their respective careers rather differently.
You're ambitious.
Well, maybe I'd like to get away from comics. Maybe I'd like to be in a 4:40 show and have Sunday nights off.
You'll do it too, Dixie.
You don't mean that.
I can see it right now. Your name up there. What's your real name, honey?
Deborah Hoople.
Deborah Ho... You think you...
Yeah, maybe just Dixie.
During that period, when Stanwyck was freelancing and working for different studios and trying different things and even going into television, you know, Robert Taylor stayed in the saddle. He stayed at MGM. It's hard to imagine the conversations they had when she's saying, oh, I fought with my boss, or I got in a shouting match with Howard Hawks today, and he's saying, well, I clocked in at 8:15 and I went home at 5:30. So it's kind of like the bohemian artist and the construction worker hanging out together. You know, he was stable, he was dependable. And, you know, he would do anything they put him in.
In 1941, the United States went to war. The studios were asked to serve the national war effort. Homebred American stars, like Robert Taylor, became propaganda weapons.
MGM were told during the war that the Russians were our allies, and we need to make movies glorifying the Russians. So Robert Taylor made a movie in perfect innocence called Song of Russia.
Song of Russia was a foo-foo film, you know, trying to make Russia look more palatable to the United States and friendly.
If we were in America and I were asked to describe you, I'd say, what a girl.
It would be very nice to hear, even in Moscow.
Taylor wanted to go to war, and he basically said he wasn't going to do the movie, and Louis B. Mayer said, well, then you're not going into the Navy. So he could have stopped him. And so once again, you know, he's in a quandary. And so he did the movie.
Once the movie was completed, Taylor went directly from the MGM studios to the U.S. Air Force Base, where he became lieutenant instructor.
By tilting your hand, you're increasing its angle of attack. With that in mind, let's see what really happens to the airplane when we do a wing-level stall.
He was always interested in flying aircraft, so he flew his own planes.
The more he flew, the more he did things at the airport, the more time he was away from her and not doing something that she could share with him. And it became a definite bone of contention.
Anyone who's married and wants to stay married knows that you have to actually spend time together as a couple. I think they did in their romance. That's what drew them together in the 30s when they got together. But they were busy by the new decade in the 40s. Stanwyck is at the apex of her career. She's the highest paid woman in America in 1944.
During the 1940s was the time of film noir. And Barbara Stanwyck cannot be a better film noir actress. She lived film noir. When Double Indemnity was made, this was the part that was made for Barbara Stanwyck. This is a film noir film of film noirs. It's about a murderess.
She's so good at being immune to emotion in that film, and I think that really gives the believability to the heartlessness of Phyllis Dietrichson, that she really is just deceiving these men for money and a better lifestyle, and there's nothing else to her.
Barbara Stanwyck is not the first person you'd think of in a part like that, but that's exactly what Billy Wilder wanted. He didn't want somebody who seemed corrupt and seemed decadent. He didn't want a dragon lady type part. He wanted a dazzling, dizzying girl next door with really great legs, and that's what he got with Barbara Stanwyck. That was the part that made us fall in love with Barbara Stanwyck, and it was the part that made us a little bit frightened of her as well.
It was a film that was looking at the dark side of Southern California and the American dream in a period that we don't think about that level of complexity going on in Hollywood cinema.
Hollywood was then going through a major political crisis. It was the era of McCarthyism and witch hunts.
It really was fashionable in creative circles to be leftist, to be for the proletariat. She wasn't. She was one of the members of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals.
Motion Picture Alliance was a group of staunch conservative actors, directors, a few writers, although most of the writers were on the other side of the fence. And they got together to try to make sure communism didn't enter the industry.
Robert Taylor was a member of it, and the usual suspects were, Ginger Rogers, Adolphe Menjou, the Red Baiters.
She was on the same side as he was. And that was something they shared for a while, which they had kind of been rocky, and that brought them back together for a while. And in 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee decided they wanted to do basically a Hollywood production to make these big-name actors come in and testify loudly and boldly against communism.
And they thought there were particularly a lot of scriptwriters from New York who were leftist and were trying to get communist propaganda into their films. And the House Un-American Activities Committee called Robert Taylor.
Ironically, Taylor was under scrutiny for a film that he didn't want to do, the pro-communist Song of Russia.
Robert Taylor was one of Hollywood's great flag-waving right-wing conservatives. So it's really funny that he ended up literally frying in hot water over a movie that he made under contract to the studio which made it.
Do you recall the names of any of the actors in the Guild who participate in such activity?
Well, yes, sir. I can name a few who seem to sort of disrupt things once in a while. Whether or not they're communists, I don't know.
Would you name those for the committee, please?
Well, the one chap I'm thinking of currently is Mr. Howard De Silva. Always seems to have something to say at the wrong time.
The artist denounced by Robert Taylor joined what was later called the blacklist. These 300 supposed communists were banned from any activity in Hollywood until the late 1950s.
He's one of the few actors who came and actually named names. They were pressing on him, So it's bad. It's a very bad thing.
He probably did what he did in good conscience at the time, but it's came back and bitten him in the butt since then. It's kind of hurt his reputation.
He did not lose his career after that happened. In fact, it evolved. But since he died, he has been reverse blacklisted.
There was a building in the 80s at MGM that was designated the Robert Taylor Building, and they took his name off the door. It's now the George Cukor Building. That's the only time they've ever did that.
East Side, West Side is a man's story about women. This woman. And this woman.
You have to understand, Bran. Something in him hates the idea of being tied down, responsible, settled, but he'll change, you'll see. He'll change.
East Side, West Side is an ensemble movie. Stanwyck is the cheated-on wife. Ava Gardner is the femme fatale. And that's what was happening, apparently, off the set as well.
Ava Gardner wrote in her own memoirs that they had an affair, that he was an excellent lover, that he was a wonderful man.
What's awful is that Ava Gardner, even though she isn't a tenth of the actress Stanwyck is, she steals that movie because she's just so physically resplendent at that point. And so that must have been very embarrassing and humiliating for her, unfortunately.
This wasn't the first time Bob had cheated. In 1941, he had almost left her to be with Lana Turner.
she seemed to realize that he was growing up and becoming his own man. She didn't have the same control over him, and she would become derogatory. There are many a story about her yelling at him in public groups and saying things that were not nice. And that just started to bother him more and more.
He wants to get out of Hollywood, Robert Taylor, and he is getting jobs. And finally, by the 1950s, came a time when all the studios were starting to make films outside the country, or outside Los Angeles, for that matter. And one of them was Quo Vadis.
Quo Vadis was one of the first times that Hollywood made a colossal biblical-style epic, and they didn't do it on the back lot. They shot some of it in the studio, but they went and took over all of Cinecittà Studios in Italy for about a year.
We're talking a major epic film. We're talking thousands of extras, a lot of costumes, shiploads of people and equipment coming over, like a war, like the army. So in all the aspects of Rome, and building Nero's palace, almost everything from costumes to hair design to jewelry were all handmade.
It went over budget. It went over budget by millions of dollars. And it was one of the first Heaven's Gate type productions where the studio back in Hollywood was throwing off memos and screaming, and the studio executives were stomping their feet. But for the first time, they couldn't just walk down to the soundstage and scream at the director, because the director was 6,000 miles away.
In this first Technicolor peplum, a Roman officer falls in love with a young Christian woman. Nero is played by Peter Ustinov. But on set, it's Robert Taylor who behaves like an emperor.
There was one woman by the name of Leah DeLeo, and Leah had a role that was that long in the movie. If you looked for her, you probably didn't even see her. She was a manicurist to Nero, and yet she caught his attention. He was far enough away from Barbara, and he just threw all caution to the wind. So it became really obvious really fast that Robert Taylor was having an affair.
You know, this is a man who'd been stifled and dominated, and he was sick of all that. So we can see it from his point of view as well.
Hollywood was changing. You know, we weren't in the 30s anymore. We were in the 50s. And there weren't people like Eddie Mannix to threaten to break someone's hands if they printed a story. So the tabloids were able to say whatever they wanted about whoever they wanted.
And that information made the tabloids, and it made it back to Los Angeles. And Barbara heard about it. She challenged him. She said, if you're going to keep acting like this, basically, I want a divorce. And he said, okay.
I don't think she wanted to get divorced. I think that ultimately was something that he acquiesced to. She would take a divorce in the same way that she would take a negotiation with a Hollywood studio.
Even though she was one of the highest paid actresses at that time, she insisted on alimony from him.
She asked for a portion of his salary for the rest of her life, until the day he died or until the day she died. And Robert Taylor was not a man to argue. You know, he wanted this done, he wanted it over with, and he gave it to her.
He eventually gave up 15% of his income. The divorce was finalized in Beverly Hills on February 21st, 1951. A few months later, Robert Taylor met the woman he considered the love of his life.
He met Ursula Tease, a German actress, and she was breathtakingly beautiful. He had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and they ended up buying what has become famous now. They still call it the Robert Taylor Ranch.
Twice, Barbara tried unsuccessfully to start a family. She eventually gave up and never remarried.
When she starts doing these westerns in the 50s, she's playing women who are running their own ranches, as she did herself.
Especially when it involved horses, she did her own stunts, and she was an accomplished horsewoman. her roles in the 50s are so interesting. Like 40 Guns, that movie is crazy. She's in her 50s by that point, and all the men in that film, regardless of their age, want to sleep with her. And then she has this posse of men that basically do what she says. I mean, she is the boss.
I think the scene in 40 Guns tells you a lot about what she's like in real life. This man is confessing his love. I love you, I've loved you my whole life. I'll do anything for you. And being weak like that, there's almost nothing going on in her face, and it's like, I need to keep this over here. I'm not going to even deal with this weakness right here. If you want to know who Barbara Stanwyck was and what she felt, that's the scene to look at.
As Hollywood films began to be shot more on location, it's interesting, she didn't make films in Europe like Taylor and so many other Hollywood actors. She stays more homeward bound.
What's sad is that her personal life ground to a halt, and also her professional life started to ground to a halt. And it's because a lot of the production had moved to Europe, and she hated flying, and she didn't like traveling. And so she stayed in Hollywood. She didn't want to leave Hollywood. She was an older woman, she had the gray hair, and so all that was left to her was television.
By 1964, she's practically, she's a big star on TV, etc. And William Castle is this, he's known for horror films and suspense films, and he had a big cult following and everything. And he convinced her to be in his film, The Night Walker, which is a film about dreams and horrors.
Night Walker was kind of a way to bring a little bit of old school Hollywood glamour, a little bit of class to a shoddy, shady William Castle horror movie. So who are you going to hire if you want a little old school Hollywood glamour? You get Robert Taylor and you get Barbara Stanwyck.
Night Walker.
I think William Castle saw that there could be a spark between them still. But I don't think he was trying to do any kind of matchmaking or anything like that.
I love you so much.
That is the voice of a woman asleep, dreaming. Does her lover exist? Is he real, or is he only a dream lover? This can happen to you, too.
They're basically playing character parts, She's playing the terrorized victim, and he's the slightly mysterious, benefactor or person that's actually secretly tormenting her. And, so they get to have a little bit of fun with that, and they were such pros that I don't think they had a moment's hesitation or problem working with each other, even though they were divorced.
But the two ex-spouses didn't get another opportunity to work together. Heavy smoker Robert Taylor died prematurely on June 8, 1969, at the age of 57.
Robert Taylor was the longest-running contract actor in the history of Hollywood for any studio. There was one of the gatekeepers, one of the guards, said that when Robert Taylor left the studio that last time, it was time to turn out the lights. It was all done. Because, if he was gone, they were all gone.
Barbara Stanwyck died on January 20th, 1990. At 82, she remained famous thanks to television. But The Night Walker, also starring Robert Taylor, would be her last appearance in a theatrical film.
I think there was some significance in the fact that her last big screen performance was opposite the love of her life, was opposite Robert Taylor. In a way, that's kind of a nice way for her to go out. She's looking into the eyes of maybe her all-time favorite leading man one last time.
It was a relationship built out of need in some ways.
Their love story was a matter of convenience. I think that can be agreed on. And I think what it shows is that a relationship of convenience can sometimes become something genuine, can become something real.
Sometimes, occasionally, the movies want something to be true so badly that eventually it really does become true. And I think that's what happened with Robert Taylor and with Barbara Stanwyck.